The auditorium fell silent as the President of the United States rose from his seat. 2,000 people watched as he looked directly at me, raised his hand in a crisp salute, and spoke my name with reverence. Colonel Sarah Mitchell. But 37 years earlier, my own father had looked at his struggling daughter and declared with absolute certainty that I would never amount to anything. This is the story of how the little girl he dismissed became the woman he never thought possible. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The smell of motor oil and disappointment hung heavy in my father's garage that September afternoon in 1987. I was 12 years old, sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor, trying to rebuild a small engine I'd found in the scrap pile. My hands were black with grease, my school clothes ruined, but I didn't care. There was something magical about taking broken things apart and figuring out how to make them work again. "Sarah Elizabeth, get out of there right now!" My mother's voice echoed through the garage. "Look at the state of you. We have dinner guests coming, and you look like a common mechanic." I looked up to see both my parents standing in the doorway. Mom wore her best dress and that pinched expression she got when she was embarrassed by me. Dad just shook his head, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "She's hopeless, Margaret," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of resignation. "Look at her. 12 years old and she can't even keep herself clean for 5 minutes, can't focus on her schoolwork, can't sit still in church, can't act like a proper young lady should." I wanted to show him the engine, to explain how I'd figured out that the carburetor was flooded and how I'd already cleaned 3 of the spark plugs. Instead, I just sat there, feeling the weight of his disappointment settle over me like a heavy blanket. "Thomas, don't be so harsh," Mom said, but her heart wasn't in the defense. Dad crouched down to my eye level, and for a moment, I thought he might ask about what I was working on. Instead, he just sighed deeply. "Sarah, you need to understand something. The world doesn't reward girls who get their hands dirty. You think playing with engines is going to get you somewhere in life? You think any of this," he gestured at the scattered tools and parts around me, "is going to matter when you're older?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him that it felt important, that when I fixed something broken, it made sense in a way that nothing else did. But the words stuck in my throat. "She'll never achieve anything if she keeps this up," he continued, standing up and brushing dust from his knees. "Mark my words, Margaret, she'll end up disappointed and broke, chasing after dreams that aren't meant for girls like her." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my father's words echoing in my mind. The engine parts I'd been working on sat in a cardboard box in my closet, hidden away like some shameful secret. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to forget the way his voice had sounded so certain, so final. The next morning at Jefferson Middle School, I found myself paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. How the other girls in my class talked about clothes and movies, while I found myself drawn to the construction happening across the street, watching the workers operate heavy machinery. How my science teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, always seemed surprised when I knew the answers to her questions about how things worked. During lunch, I sat alone at my usual table, picking at a peanut butter sandwich and watching the boys in my grade arm wrestle and compete over everything. Tommy Richardson was bragging about how his older brother was going to join the Army after high school. "My dad says the Army makes men out of boys," Tommy announced loudly. "Says it's where you go to prove what you're really made of." Something stirred in my chest at those words. I thought about the engine in my closet, about the way my hands seemed to know instinctively how to fit pieces together. I thought about my father's certainty that I would never achieve anything worthwhile. That afternoon, I walked home a different route, past the Army recruiting station on Maple Street. The windows were covered with posters showing soldiers operating complex equipment, fixing helicopters, working on sophisticated electronics. I pressed my face to the glass, studying every detail. These people looked focused, capable, and important. They looked like they were achieving something. When I got home, Dad was in his usual spot in the living room, reading the newspaper and nursing a beer. The local news was playing on the television, something about budget cuts affecting the nearby military base. "Dad," I said, settling onto the couch beside him, "what do you know about the Army?" He looked at me over the top of his newspaper, eyebrows raised. "The Army? That's not something you need to worry about, sweetheart. That's for young men looking to make themselves." "But what if girls wanted to join?" He folded the newspaper and set it aside, giving me his full attention for the first time in weeks. "Sarah, honey, I know you get these ideas sometimes. But the military isn't a place for girls." "Oh, sure, they let women do some jobs now, but nothing important, nothing that really matters. You'd be better off focusing on something more suitable."
Like what? Teaching, maybe, or nursing? Something that uses your natural instincts to take care of people. I wanted to argue, to point out that I'd never shown any particular interest in taking care of anyone, that what I loved was figuring out how things worked, solving problems, building and fixing. But I could see in his face that he'd already made up his mind about what I was capable of. The weeks that followed felt different somehow. I started paying closer attention in my math and science classes, not because anyone expected me to, but because I was beginning to understand that knowledge might be my way out of the small box everyone seemed determined to keep me in. My grades, which had always been decent, began to climb. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed first. After class one day in October, she asked me to stay behind. "Sarah, I've been watching your work lately, and I'm impressed. You have a natural aptitude for problem solving that I don't see very often. Have you given any thought to what you might want to do after high school?" I thought about my father's words, about how certain he'd been that I would never achieve anything. "I'm not sure yet, Mrs. Rodriguez. Maybe something with fixing things?" She smiled, the first time I could remember a teacher looking genuinely excited about something I'd said. Engineering, perhaps, or maybe something in the technical fields. "Sarah, there are so many opportunities opening up for young women who aren't afraid of a challenge." That evening at dinner, I decided to test the waters. "Mrs. Rodriguez thinks I might be good at engineering." Dad looked up from his meatloaf, fork suspended halfway to his mouth. "Engineering? Sarah, that's not realistic. Those jobs require years of difficult study, complex mathematics, and real technical expertise. They're not for everyone." "But what if I'm good at it?" Mom reached over and patted my hand. "Sweetie, it's nice that your teacher is encouraging, but we need to be practical. Engineering is a very competitive field, and it's mostly men. You don't want to spend years preparing for something that might not work out." I felt that familiar weight settling over me again, but this time something else stirred underneath it. A small flame of defiance that I'd never felt before. What if I wanted to try anyway? The silence stretched across the dinner table. Finally, Dad set down his fork and looked me directly. "Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. I love you, and I want what's best for you, but you need to be realistic about your limitations. You're a smart girl, but you're not exceptional. You're not the kind of person who achieves extraordinary things. The sooner you accept that and focus on something attainable, the happier you'll be." His words hit me like a physical blow, but underneath the hurt, something harder was forming, a determination I didn't fully understand yet, but could feel growing stronger with each passing day. That night, I pulled the engine parts out of my closet and spread them across my bedroom floor. By the light of my desk lamp, I worked until nearly midnight, my hands moving with quiet confidence as I assembled pieces that belonged together. When I finally finished, the small engine sat complete and perfect on my carpet. I didn't know it then, But that moment would define everything that came after. The night I decided that my father's certainty about my limitations would become the fuel for proving him wrong. High school arrived like a storm I wasn't prepared for. Lincoln High was 3 times larger than Jefferson Middle, and suddenly I was surrounded by teenagers who seemed to know exactly who they were and where they belonged. I didn't fit anywhere, obviously. Not with the popular girls who spent lunch period discussing makeup tutorials, not with the academic achievers who formed study groups for college prep courses, and definitely not with the rebels who smoked behind the gymnasium. Instead, I found myself gravitating toward the automotive shop class, even though I was only one of 2 girls enrolled. The other was Jessica Chen, whose father owned a chain of auto repair shops and who could diagnose transmission problems by sound alone. On my first day, Mr. Hendricks, the shop teacher, looked at me skeptically. "Mitchell, you sure you're in the right place? Home economics is down the hall." I straightened my shoulders, thinking of that rebuilt engine still sitting on my bedroom dresser. I'm exactly where I belong. The boys in class ranged from mildly curious to openly hostile. Danny Walsh, a senior with arms covered in motor oil stains, made it his mission to prove I didn't belong there. "Hey, princess," he called out during my second week, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Think you can handle changing the oil on this Chevy without breaking a nail?" I walked over to the beat-up pickup truck he was indicating, popped the hood, and spent the next 20 minutes not only changing the oil, but also diagnosing and fixing a loose alternator belt he hadn't even noticed. When I finished, I wiped my hands on a shop rag and looked directly at him.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Anything else, Walsh? Word spread quickly through the school that the quiet girl from the automotive shop had skills. But at home, the temperature seemed to drop every time I mentioned my classes. "Sarah's grades are excellent," Mom reported to Dad over dinner one evening in October. "All A's and B's, except she's taking that shop class instead of something more appropriate." Dad looked across the table at me, his expression unreadable. "Shop class. Really, Sarah, what exactly do you think that's preparing you for?" "Maybe mechanical engineering or aerospace. There are lots of opportunities in technical fields now." He set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "Opportunities? For who exactly?" "Sarah, I work with engineers every day at the plant. I see what it takes to succeed in that world. It's not just about being able to fix an engine. It's about competing with people who've been preparing for these careers their entire lives. People with advantages you don't have." "What advantages?" "Connections, money for the best schools, families who understand how these industries work." He paused, and his voice grew gentler but somehow more devastating. "Honey, I'm not trying to crush your dreams. I'm trying to save you from disappointment. There's nothing wrong with having more realistic goals." That night, I called Jessica Chen. Her family had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 8, and she had a way of cutting through emotional noise to get to practical solutions. "Your dad's scared," she said matter-of-factly. "My parents were the same way when I told them I wanted to study mechanical systems instead of becoming a doctor or lawyer. They think if they can't see the path clearly, it doesn't exist." "So what did you do?" "I stopped asking for permission and started building proof." The next day, Jessica and I started staying after school to work on independent projects. Mr. Hendricks, initially reluctant to give us access to the advanced equipment, became our biggest supporter when we successfully rebuilt a motorcycle engine that had been sitting in the corner for 3 years. "You girls have something special," he told us one afternoon as we fine-tuned the carburetor settings. "Raw talent, sure, but more importantly, you don't give up when something doesn't work the first time. That's rarer than you might think." By spring of my sophomore year, word had reached the guidance counselor's office about my automotive achievements.
Mrs. Patterson called me in for what she termed a career planning conversation. Sarah, I've been reviewing your academic record and I'm impressed. Your math and science scores are in the top 10% of your class. Combined with your practical skills, you have some interesting options opening up. She pulled out a thick folder and spread several brochures across her desk. Most were for traditional four-year colleges, but one caught my attention immediately. The cover showed a young woman in military fatigues, hands deep in the engine compartment of what looked like a tank. Military service? I asked, picking up the brochure. The armed forces offer excellent technical training programs, full scholarships, hands-on experience with some of the most advanced equipment in the world, and when you complete your service, employers compete to hire veterans with your skill set. I studied the images inside the brochure. Women operating complex machinery, working on aircraft systems, leading technical teams. These weren't the limited roles my father had described. How would someone get started? Mrs. Patterson smiled. There's a recruiter who visits our school every month. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez. She's actually a mechanical systems specialist herself. Would you like to arrange a meeting? 3 weeks later, I sat across from Sergeant Gonzalez in Mrs. Patterson's office, my palms sweating despite the air conditioning. She was younger than I had expected, maybe late 20s, with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that reminded me of my own. Sarah, I've reviewed your academic records and spoken with Mr. Hendricks about your shop work. Impressive stuff. Tell me, what draws you to military service? I thought about my father's words, about the certainty in his voice when he predicted my failure. I want to do something that matters, something important, and I want to work with technology, complex systems. Those are good motivations, but I need to be honest with you about what military life actually involves. It's demanding, both physically and mentally. You'll be held to extremely high standards, and there's no room for giving up when things get difficult. Are you prepared for that level of challenge?
Something in her tone reminded me of the way my father spoke when he was testing whether I was serious about something or just daydreaming. But this time, instead of feeling dismissed, I felt energized. I think I am. I know I am. Sergeant Gonzalez leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. The Army has a program called 91B, Wheeled Vehicle Mechanic. It's intensive training on everything from basic maintenance to advanced diagnostics on military vehicles. After that, if your performance is exceptional, there are opportunities to specialize further. Aviation maintenance, armor systems, even experimental technology development. My heart was racing, but I tried to keep my voice steady. What would I need to do to qualify? Finish high school with strong grades in math and science, which you're already on track for. Pass the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, the ASVAB. Complete basic training and advanced individual training. Then prove yourself capable of handling increasingly complex responsibilities. She paused, and her expression grew more serious. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you considering this path because it's what you genuinely want, or because you're trying to prove something to someone else? The question caught me off guard. I sat in silence for several long moments, thinking about the engine on my dresser, about the satisfaction I felt when complex problems yielded to careful analysis, about the way I'd always been drawn to understanding how things worked. Both, I think, I finally said. I love this kind of work. But yes, I also want to prove that someone like me can succeed at something significant. Sergeant Gonzalez nodded approvingly. That's an honest answer. The best soldiers I know are motivated by both passion for the work and determination to exceed expectations. Just remember, once you commit to this path, you'll be judged solely on your performance. The military doesn't care about your background or anyone else's opinions about your potential. You'll succeed or fail based entirely on what you're capable of achieving. After she left, I sat in my car in the school parking lot staring at the recruitment material she had given me. The weight of possibility felt both thrilling and terrifying. This was a concrete path forward, a way to transform the mechanical aptitude I'd always felt into something substantial and respected. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of keeping my military interest secret, I would tell my parents directly. It was time to stop seeking permission and start building proof, just as Jessica had suggested. But first, I had 2.5 more years of high school to complete, and I intended to make every single day count toward preparing for the challenge ahead.
Mom had moved closer, and now she sat beside me on the sofa. Sweetheart, we've seen what military life does to families. Your Uncle Jim was never the same after Vietnam. He came home different, distant, and that was decades ago when things were supposedly simpler. I pulled the brochures from behind my back and spread them on the coffee table. Look at these programs: advanced electronics, aviation maintenance, armor systems. These aren't dead-end jobs. These are pathways to engineering careers. Dad picked up one of the brochures, flipped through it quickly, then set it aside. Marketing materials, Sarah. They're designed to make military service look glamorous and promising. The reality is harsh discipline, dangerous conditions, and limited opportunities for advancement unless you fit a very specific mold. What mold is that? The question escaped before I could stop it, and I immediately regretted the confrontational tone. Dad's expression hardened. People from military families, people who understand the culture, who have connections, who know how to navigate the system. People who've been preparing for this kind of life since childhood. He paused, and his voice grew gentler but more final. Sarah, you're not that person. You're a small-town girl with big dreams, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the military will chew you up and spit you out, and you'll come home 4 years later with nothing to show for it except regrets. The certainty in his voice transported me back to that garage 7 years earlier, to the weight of his disappointment and the finality of his predictions about my future. But this time, something different stirred inside me. Not just hurt, but anger. Clean, focused anger at being dismissed so completely. "What if you're wrong?" I asked quietly. "I'm not wrong, Sarah. I've been around long enough to recognize when someone is setting themselves up for failure." I gathered the brochures and stood up. Then I guess we'll find out, won't we? The next few months were tense at home. My parents clearly hoped my military interest would fade like previous enthusiasm, but I threw myself into preparation with systematic determination. I spent every free period in the school library researching military occupational specialties, studying for the ASVAB, and reading everything I could find about women in technical military roles. Jessica Chen became my unofficial study partner, helping me strengthen my weak areas in electronics theory while I helped her with advanced mathematics. We developed a routine of staying after school until the custodians kicked us out, then continuing our sessions at the local diner until closing time. "Your parents are still fighting you on this?" Jessica asked one evening in February, looking up from a practice test on electrical circuits. Fighting implies they take it seriously. They're just waiting for me to come to my senses. Maybe that's better than active opposition. My dad threatened to cut off college funding if I didn't drop the automotive program and focus on pre-med courses. What did you do? Jessica smiled grimly. I applied for scholarships and started saving every penny from my part-time job. Sometimes you have to be willing to walk away from safety to get what you want. In March, I took the ASVAB at the local recruiting station. The test covered everything from basic math and reading comprehension to mechanical reasoning and electronics knowledge. I walked out feeling cautiously optimistic, but the real surprise came 2 weeks later when Sergeant Gonzalez called me at home. "Sarah, I have your scores. You tested in the 95th percentile overall, with perfect marks in mechanical comprehension and electronics information.
These results qualify you for any technical specialty in the Army, including some of our most advanced programs. I almost dropped the phone. Are you sure? I'm looking at the official results right now. Sarah, scores like these open doors to opportunities most recruits never see. Have you given any more thought to your specific career interests? Over the following weeks, Sergeant Gonzalez introduced me to concepts I'd never imagined. Advanced helicopter maintenance programs that led to positions with defense contractors, experimental vehicle development projects that pushed the boundaries of military technology, leadership tracks that combined technical expertise with command responsibility. There's something else, she said during one of our meetings in April. The Army has partnerships with several major universities for continuing education programs. Soldiers with exceptional performance records can earn bachelor's and even master's degrees while serving with full tuition coverage. The possibilities were intoxicating, but they also felt overwhelming. Each conversation with Sergeant Gonzalez revealed new layers of complexity in military career development, pathways I'd never known existed.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Anything else, Walsh? Word spread quickly through the school that the quiet girl from the automotive shop had skills. But at home, the temperature seemed to drop every time I mentioned my classes. Sarah's grades are excellent, Mom reported to Dad over dinner one evening in October. All A's and B's, except she's taking that shop class instead of something more appropriate. Dad looked across the table at me, his expression unreadable. Shop class. Really, Sarah, what exactly do you think that's preparing you for? Maybe mechanical engineering or aerospace. There are lots of opportunities in technical fields now. He set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. Opportunities. For who exactly? Sarah, I work with engineers every day at the plant. I see what it takes to succeed in that world. It's not just about being able to fix an engine. It's about competing with people who've been preparing for these careers their entire lives. People with advantages you don't have. What advantages? Connections, money for the best schools, families who understand how these industries work. He paused, and his voice grew gentler but somehow more devastating. Honey, I'm not trying to crush your dreams. I'm trying to save you from disappointment. There's nothing wrong with having more realistic goals. That night, I called Jessica Chen. Her family had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 8, and she had a way of cutting through emotional noise to get to practical solutions. Your dad's scared, she said matter-of-factly. My parents were the same way when I told them I wanted to study mechanical systems instead of becoming a doctor or lawyer. They think if they can't see the path clearly, it doesn't exist. So what did you do? I stopped asking for permission and started building proof. The next day, Jessica and I started staying after school to work on independent projects. Mr. Hendricks, initially reluctant to give us access to the advanced equipment, became our biggest supporter when we successfully rebuilt a motorcycle engine that had been sitting in the corner for 3 years. You girls have something special, he told us one afternoon as we fine-tuned the carburetor settings. Raw talent, sure, but more importantly, you don't give up when something doesn't work the first time. That's rarer than you might think. By spring of my sophomore year, word had reached the guidance counselor's office about my automotive achievements. Mrs. Patterson called me in for what she termed a career planning conversation. Sarah, I've been reviewing your academic record and I'm impressed. Your math and science scores are in the top 10% of your class. Combined with your practical skills, you have some interesting options opening up. She pulled out a thick folder and spread several brochures across her desk. Most were for traditional four-year colleges, but one caught my attention immediately. The cover showed a young woman in military fatigues, hands deep in the engine compartment of what looked like a tank. Military service? I asked, picking up the brochure.
The armed forces offer excellent technical training programs, full scholarships, hands-on experience with some of the most advanced equipment in the world, and when you complete your service, employers compete to hire veterans with your skill set. I studied the images inside the brochure. Women operating complex machinery, working on aircraft systems, leading technical teams. These weren't the limited roles my father had described. How would someone get started? Mrs. Patterson smiled. There's a recruiter who visits our school every month. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez. She's actually a mechanical systems specialist herself. Would you like to arrange a meeting? 3 weeks later, I sat across from Sergeant Gonzalez in Mrs. Patterson's office, my palms sweating despite the air conditioning. She was younger than I had expected, maybe late 20s, with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that reminded me of my own. Sarah, I've reviewed your academic records and spoken with Mr. Hendricks about your shop work. Impressive stuff. Tell me, what draws you to military service? I thought about my father's words, about the certainty in his voice when he predicted my failure. I want to do something that matters, something important, and I want to work with technology, complex systems. Those are good motivations, but I need to be honest with you about what military life actually involves. It's demanding, both physically and mentally. You'll be held to extremely high standards, and there's no room for giving up when things get difficult. Are you prepared for that level of challenge?
The next 6 weeks were a blur of preparation and secret planning. I found a small studio apartment 3 blocks from the high school, barely more than a room with a kitchenette, but clean and affordable. Mr. Henderson, my boss at the auto shop, agreed to increase my hours and provide a letter confirming my employment stability. Mrs. Rodriguez and 2 other teachers provided character references, and even Sergeant Gonzalez contributed a statement about my military aptitude and career potential. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy at home while preparing to leave it behind. Every family dinner felt loaded with significance. Every casual conversation with my parents carried the weight of potential finality. They had no idea that I was systematically dismantling the life they'd built for me, preparing to step into an uncertain future entirely on my own terms. Jessica Chen was the only person who knew the full scope of what I was attempting. She helped me move my belongings to the new apartment in small batches, smuggling boxes of clothes and personal items out of my parents' house like we were planning a military operation. "Are you sure about this?" she asked one evening as we arranged my few pieces of secondhand furniture. "Once you file those papers, there's no going back. Even if you change your mind later, the relationship with your parents will never be the same." I looked around the tiny apartment, my apartment, with its single window overlooking the parking lot of a convenience store. It wasn't much, but it represented something I'd never had before, complete autonomy over my own choices. I'm sure. I have to be. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in May, 2 weeks before my high school graduation. I wore my only professional outfit, a navy blue dress I'd bought at a thrift store, and carried a folder containing every piece of documentation Ms. Kowalski had requested. My parents arrived at the courthouse looking stunned and betrayed. Dad wore his best suit, the one reserved for weddings and funerals, while Mom clutched a tissue and avoided making eye contact with me. It was the first time they'd learned about my legal petition, and the shock on their faces made my stomach twist with guilt. "Sarah Elizabeth," Dad said as we waited outside the courtroom, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and hurt that I'd never heard before. "How could you do this? How could you go behind our backs, plan all this in secret?" "Because you wouldn't listen. Because you made it clear that my opinions about my own future didn't matter. We're your parents. We know what's best for you." "No, Dad. You know what feels safe to you. There's a difference." Judge Margaret Foster was a stern-looking woman in her 50s who had clearly presided over many family conflicts. She reviewed my documentation carefully, asked detailed questions about my finances and living arrangements, and listened to both sides as they presented their arguments. Ms. Kowalski spoke about my demonstrated maturity, my clear career goals, and my ability to support myself independently. My parents' attorney, a family friend named Robert Hayes, argued that I was making an impulsive decision that would limit my future opportunities and damage family relationships. Then, Judge Foster asked me to speak directly. "Miss Mitchell,
Emancipation is not something the court grants lightly. It means you'll be legally responsible for every aspect of your life: financial, medical, educational, and otherwise. Your parents will have no obligation to support you, and you'll have no legal claim on their assistance if things don't work out as planned. Do you understand the full implications of what you're requesting? I stood up, my legs shaking slightly, and looked directly at her. Yes, Your Honor. I understand that I am asking to be judged solely on my own merits and my own decisions. That's exactly what I want. And you believe military service is the right path for your future? I believe it's my path to choose, Your Honor. Whether it's right or wrong, I need the freedom to find out for myself. Judge Foster was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the papers before her. Finally, she looked up and addressed the entire courtroom. The court finds that Miss Mitchell has demonstrated financial independence, mature decision-making, and a clear understanding of the responsibilities she's requesting. While the court recognizes her parents' concerns and their obvious love for their daughter, the evidence suggests that Miss Mitchell is capable of making informed decisions about her own future. My heart stopped beating for what felt like several seconds. Therefore, the petition for emancipation is granted. Miss Mitchell, you are hereby declared a legal adult with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and suddenly, I was free. Legally, completely, irreversibly free to make my own choices about my life. I looked over at my parents, expecting to see anger or disappointment. Instead, I saw something much more complex. Dad's face showed a mixture of hurt, pride, and what might have been the first glimmer of respect he'd ever shown for my determination.
But there would be time to process family relationships later. First, I had a phone call to make to Sergeant Gonzalez. 3 days after the court hearing, I sat in the military processing station in Chicago, surrounded by dozens of other young people who'd made the same life-altering decision. The atmosphere buzzed with nervous energy. Some recruits bragged loudly about their motivations, while others sat quietly, staring at forms with the weight of commitment settling over them. Sergeant Gonzalez had expedited my processing once my emancipation became official. Now, at barely 18 and legally independent, I was signing documents that would control the next 4 years of my life. My chosen military occupational specialty, 91B, wheeled vehicle mechanic, with a follow-on school option for helicopter maintenance if my performance warranted it. Second thoughts? Asked the young man sitting beside me. He looked maybe 19, with the kind of confident smile that suggested he'd never encountered a problem he couldn't charm his way through. I'm Kevin Martinez, by the way. Going infantry. You? Sarah Mitchell, vehicle maintenance. Smart choice. My older brother says the technical specialties get treated better. Better duty stations, more opportunities after you get out. He lowered his voice conspiratorially. Plus, you'll probably never see combat. Mechanics stay safe on base while guys like me get shot at. I wanted to tell him that combat wasn't what scared me. What terrified me was the possibility that my father might be right, that I'd discover I wasn't as capable as I believed, that 4 years from now I'd return home with nothing to show for my sacrifice, except the knowledge that I'd been wrong about myself. The bus ride to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri took 6 hours through flat farmland that looked remarkably similar to the Illinois countryside I'd left behind. But everything felt different now. I was traveling toward a future I'd chosen entirely for myself, carrying nothing but a small duffel bag and the weight of my own expectations. Basic training was designed to break down civilian identity and rebuild it in military form. For most recruits, this meant surrendering individuality, learning to function as part of a unit, accepting that personal preferences mattered less than collective effectiveness. For me, it meant something more complex, proving that the girl my father had dismissed could survive in an environment specifically designed to eliminate weakness. Dr. Sergeant Patricia Williams was a compact woman who radiated authority from every pore. She stood maybe 5'4", but her presence filled any room she entered. On our first day, she lined up our platoon of 42 recruits and delivered the speech that would define the next 10 weeks. Look around you.
Half of these faces will be gone by graduation. Some will quit because basic training is harder than they expected. Some will be dismissed because they can't meet our standards. Some will get injured because they didn't take preparation seriously. Her eyes swept across our ranks, pausing briefly on each face. The Army doesn't care about your background, your excuses, or your intentions. We care about results. The physical demands were intense but manageable. Years of working in Henderson's auto shop had given me functional strength, and my stubborn refusal to quit anything I'd started served me well during the endless push-ups, sit-ups, and distance runs. But the mental challenges cut deeper. Everything was evaluated, measured, ranked. Our sleeping quarters were inspected daily for microscopic flaws. Our uniforms were examined for wrinkles invisible to civilian eyes. Our weapons were checked for cleanliness that exceeded any reasonable standard. Failure meant punishment that affected not just the individual, but the entire unit. 3 weeks into training, I faced my first real test of leadership under pressure. Our platoon had been assigned to complete a tactical field exercise, essentially a complex problem-solving scenario that required coordination between multiple teams operating different equipment. I'd been designated as the mechanic, responsible for maintaining communication between units. The radios failed 20 minutes into the exercise. Dr. Sergeant Williams appeared beside me as I frantically worked to diagnose the problem, her expression unreadable. Around us, the exercise was falling apart as teams lost contact with each other and began operating on assumptions rather than information. Mitchell, status report. I looked up from the radio components I'd spread across a field table. Sergeant, the primary communication system has multiple failures. The antenna connection is corroded, 2 of the frequency crystals are cracked, and the battery pack is showing intermittent voltage drops. Time to repair? This was the moment that would define how my unit saw me. I could give an optimistic estimate and risk failure, or provide a realistic assessment that might doom the exercise but preserve my credibility. Sergeant, with available parts and tools, I can have 1 radio fully operational in 40 minutes. A second radio could be jury-rigged to work for short-range communication only, but it would be unreliable.
She nodded curtly. Execute your repair plan. Teams will operate on your timeline. For the next hour, I worked with the focused intensity I'd learned rebuilding engines in my father's garage. Every connection had to be perfect, every component tested and retested. Around me, 41 other recruits waited for my technical skills to determine whether their mission would succeed or fail. When the first radio crackled to life and transmitted clearly to all units, a small cheer went up from the gathered soldiers. But what mattered more was Drill Sergeant Williams' reaction. She keyed the radio, ran a full communications check, then looked at me directly. Outstanding work, Mitchell. You just learned something important about leadership. Sometimes the most crucial person on a team is the one who can fix what's broken. That evening, back in the barracks, several recruits approached me with a respect I hadn't experienced before. Kevin Martinez, the confident infantry recruit I'd met at processing, sat on the edge of my bunk. That was impressive today. Where'd you learn to work on electronics like that? High school auto shop mostly, plus a lot of experimenting on my own. Your family's military? I thought about my father, probably sitting in his living room at that moment, wondering whether I was regretting my decision yet. No, my dad works at a manufacturing plant. He wasn't exactly supportive of my enlisting. Kevin was quiet for a moment. Mine either, actually. He wanted me to take over his landscaping business. Said the military was for people who couldn't make it in the real world. What changed his mind? Nothing yet. He still thinks I'm making a mistake. But I figure I've got 4 years to prove him wrong. Over the following weeks, I discovered that many of my fellow recruits carried similar burdens. Family members who'd questioned their choices, backgrounds that hadn't prepared them for military life, doubts about whether they belonged in uniform. But we also shared something else, a determination to exceed the expectations others had set for us. Advanced individual training at Fort Lee, Virginia, was where I'd either prove my technical competence or discover the limits of my abilities.
The wheeled vehicle mechanic course was intensive. 8 hours of classroom instruction, followed by 4 hours of hands-on work with military vehicles ranging from basic trucks to sophisticated armored personnel carriers. My instructor, Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, no relation to my high school friend Jessica, was a 20-year veteran who'd worked on everything from Humvees in Iraq to experimental hybrid vehicles at the Army's research facilities. On the first day, he addressed our class of 30 students with characteristic military directness. This course has a 60% graduation rate. The vehicles you'll learn to maintain cost more than most of you will earn in a decade. Mistakes aren't just expensive, they can get people killed. We're here to separate those who can handle the responsibility from those who can't. The technical complexity was exhilarating. These weren't the simple combustion engines I'd worked on in high school. Military vehicles incorporated advanced hydraulics, computerized diagnostic systems, armor integration, and specialized components designed to function in extreme environments. Every system had backup systems, and every backup had protocols for field repair under combat conditions. But it was during a night maintenance exercise in week 6 that I encountered the challenge that would define my military career trajectory. Our class had been assigned to perform emergency repairs on a convoy of vehicles that had simulated battle damage. Working by flashlight in near-freezing conditions, we had 4 hours to restore operational capability to machines with multiple, interconnected failures. My assigned vehicle was a command Humvee with what appeared to be a straightforward transmission problem. But as I dug deeper into the diagnosis, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The transmission issue was secondary to a more serious problem, a hairline crack in the engine block that would cause catastrophic failure within hours of operation. The problem was that my repair timeline didn't allow for engine replacement. I was expected to fix the transmission and move on to help other teams. Reporting the engine issue would require shutting down the vehicle entirely, which would fail the entire convoy exercise. I stared at the cracked engine block, weighing my options in the dim light of my flashlight. I could follow orders, fix the transmission, and let someone else discover the engine problem later. Or I could risk my standing in the class by reporting a failure that would complicate everyone's evening. Staff Sergeant Chen appeared beside me, his presence announced only by the soft crunch of his boots on gravel. "Status, Mitchell?" I took a deep breath and made the decision that would change everything. "Sergeant, I've identified the transmission fault and can have it operational within an hour. But I've also found a critical engine block fracture that makes this vehicle unsafe for operation. Recommend immediate replacement before any mission deployment."
He crouched beside me and examined the crack with his own flashlight. After several long minutes, he stood up and keyed his radio. "Control, this is Chen. We have a code red mechanical failure on Vehicle 7, initiating emergency protocols." As other instructors converged on our location, Staff Sergeant Chen looked down at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Mitchell, you just learned the most important lesson of your military career. Technical competence means nothing if you don't have the integrity to make hard decisions when it matters." The next morning, Staff Sergeant Chen pulled me aside after formation. His expression was serious, but there was something else in his eyes that I couldn't identify. "Mitchell, yesterday's incident has been reviewed by the training command. Your decision to report the engine failure potentially saved lives and prevented catastrophic equipment loss." He paused, studying my face. "There's an opening in an advanced program I think you should consider. Rotary wing aircraft maintenance, helicopters. It's competitive, demanding, and would extend your training by 6 months. Interested?" 6 months later, I was crawling through the engine compartment of a UH-60 Blackhawk helicopter at Fort Rucker, Alabama, troubleshooting a hydraulic system that had stumped 2 other mechanics. The machine was worth $30 million, and in 12 hours, it would be carrying special operations personnel on a classified training mission that couldn't be delayed.
Master Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, the non-commissioned officer in charge of our maintenance unit, watched as I traced hydraulic lines through impossibly tight spaces. She was a legend in Army aviation. 24 years of service, multiple deployments, and a reputation for maintaining aircraft in conditions that would challenge most civilian mechanics. Talk me through your diagnosis, Specialist Mitchell. I'd been promoted twice in 18 months, faster than average, but not unprecedented for soldiers who consistently exceeded expectations. Now suspended upside down in the aircraft's mechanical bay, I explained my findings. Sergeant, the primary hydraulic pump tests within normal parameters, and all visible lines show no signs of leakage. But I'm seeing pressure fluctuations that suggest an intermittent blockage in the system. I believe there's debris in one of the secondary filters that's causing periodic flow restriction. That filter was replaced 40 hours ago. Yes, Sergeant, but if foreign material entered the system during installation, it could lodge in downstream components and create the symptoms we're observing. She was quiet for several minutes while I continued my examination. Finally, she spoke again. Mitchell, replacing that filter means stripping half the hydraulic system. If you're wrong, we'll miss our mission deadline, and you'll explain to some very unhappy special operations personnel why their training got delayed. If I'm right, Sergeant, they'll have an aircraft they can trust with their lives. 2 hours later, I extracted a piece of metal debris the size of a fingernail clipping from exactly where I'd predicted. The aircraft systems tested perfect, the mission launched on schedule, and Master Sergeant Rodriguez submitted a commendation letter that would change the trajectory of my entire career. 3 years into my enlistment, I was selected for Warrant Officer Candidate School, a program that would transform me from an enlisted mechanic into a technical expert with leadership responsibilities. The training was brutal, designed to identify those who could handle complex technical challenges while managing teams of specialists under extreme pressure. But it was during my final exercise at Warrant Officer School that I encountered the test that would define everything that followed. Our class had been assigned to diagnose and repair a sophisticated communications helicopter that had suffered multiple system failures during a simulated combat mission. The aircraft was worth over $40 million, incorporated classified technology, and had to be operational within 8 hours for a demonstration to senior military leadership. I was appointed as the technical team leader responsible for coordinating 12 specialists working on interconnected systems that affected everything from navigation to weapons targeting. The pressure was immense. Failure would mean not just personal embarrassment, but potential damage to equipment that represented years of research and development. 4 hours into the repair timeline, we discovered that the aircraft's problems went much deeper than initially assessed. What had appeared to be routine maintenance issues were actually symptoms of a fundamental design flaw in how multiple computer systems communicated with each other. Fixing it would require essentially rewriting portions of the aircraft's operating software, work that normally took weeks of laboratory analysis. With 4 hours remaining and senior officers beginning to arrive for the demonstration, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of attempting a temporary fix that might work long enough to complete the exercise, I recommended grounding the aircraft permanently until the design flaw could be properly addressed.
Colonel Patricia Hayes, the officer overseeing our training, listened to my technical briefing with an expression that revealed nothing. When I finished explaining why the aircraft was unsafe to fly, despite appearing to function normally, she asked a single question. Warrant Officer Mitchell, you understand that your recommendation will cancel a demonstration for the Secretary of Defense, delay a program worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and potentially end your career if you're wrong about this assessment? I thought about my father, sitting in his living room 5 years earlier, certain that I would never achieve anything significant. I thought about the girl in the garage who rebuilt engines because she couldn't resist the challenge of making broken things work properly. Yes, ma'am, I understand completely. But my job isn't to make demonstrations successful. My job is to ensure that aircraft are safe for the people who fly them. The investigation that followed lasted 6 weeks. Teams of engineers and software specialists confirmed that I'd identified a critical flaw that could have resulted in catastrophic system failures during actual combat operations. The aircraft program was redesigned, incorporating safety modifications that I'd recommended. My career, rather than ending, accelerated dramatically. By my 7th year of service, I'd been promoted to Chief Warrant Officer 3 and assigned as the Senior Maintenance Officer for an aviation unit deploying to Afghanistan. Leading a team of 40 specialists maintaining a fleet of aircraft in one of the world's most challenging environments, I discovered capabilities I'd never known I possessed. The deployment tested everything I'd learned about leadership, technical expertise, and decision-making under pressure. We maintained aircraft through sandstorms that stripped paint from metal surfaces, temperature extremes that challenged every mechanical system, and operational demands that pushed both equipment and personnel beyond normal limits. But it was during a night mission in March that I faced the moment that would define my legacy. One of our helicopters had been hit by enemy fire and forced to land in hostile territory with a crew of 4 aboard. The aircraft was damaged but potentially repairable, and the crew was alive but surrounded by enemy forces with no immediate prospect of rescue. I volunteered to lead a maintenance team into the combat zone to attempt field repairs that would allow the aircraft to fly out under its own power. The mission was dangerous, technically complex, and had never been attempted under similar conditions, but it represented the only realistic chance of recovering both the aircraft and its crew. Working by night vision equipment while under sporadic enemy fire, my team and I spent 6 hours performing repairs that normally required a full maintenance facility. We rebuilt damaged hydraulic lines using field-expedient materials, bypassed destroyed electrical systems, and jury-rigged flight controls that would function long enough to reach friendly territory. When the helicopter lifted off just before dawn with all 4 crew members alive and uninjured, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The mission earned me the Bronze Star with Valor, promotion to Chief Warrant Officer 4, and assignment to the Pentagon as a technical advisor on aviation maintenance programs. But more importantly, it confirmed something I'd always suspected but never fully believed, that the girl my father had dismissed was capable of extraordinary achievement when given the chance to prove herself. 20 years after that night in Afghanistan, I found myself standing in the Pentagon's main auditorium as the newly promoted Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the Army's senior technical officer for aviation systems. The ceremony was routine, attended by family, colleagues, and senior military leadership. But then something unexpected happened. The President of the United States, who had been scheduled to make brief remarks about military technical excellence, deviated from his prepared speech. He looked directly at me, rose from his seat, and spoke words that transported me back to that 12-year-old girl sitting in her father's garage when he'd been so certain about my limitations. In the audience, sitting in the 3rd row, my father wiped tears from his eyes as he watched his daughter receive recognition from the most powerful person in the country. Later at the reception, he approached me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something I should have said 37 years ago. I was wrong. About everything. You didn't just achieve something. You achieved everything I never thought possible. And I couldn't be more proud of the woman you became in spite of my doubts." Standing there, in my dress uniform, surrounded by colleagues who respected my expertise and leadership, I realized that the most important victory wasn't the presidential recognition or the distinguished career. It was the knowledge that I'd trusted my own assessment of my capabilities over everyone else's limitations, and that faith had carried me farther than anyone, including myself, had ever imagined possible.
The girl who had rebuilt engines in her father's garage had become the woman who ensured that the most sophisticated aircraft in the world could be trusted with the lives of those who flew them. And in that moment, surrounded by evidence of achievement that had exceeded every prediction, I understood that the most powerful thing anyone can do is refuse to be limited by other people's certainty about what they can't accomplish. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.